This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Time for part 5 of Woe Unto You, Lawyers by Fred Rodell from 1939. Out of print. Chapter 6. The Law and the Lady. Quote, "We have commonly a very positive moral sense. That which they bill is right. That which they reject is wrong." Unquote. Henry Adams. The lawyers have made such a complicated mess out of the word game they call legal reasoning that any effort to dissect even a part of that reasoning and show it up for the fake that it is inevitably makes tough going. In a sense, that fact has been the intellectual Maginot Line of the law. Plenty of people have long suspected that the lawyers, with their long words, were indulging in nothing more nor less than wholesale flim-flam. But when it comes down to trying to take the flim-flam with all its myriad trappings apart, people just can't be bothered. And even a personally conducted tour through the mirror mazes of legal logic becomes tiring and confusing. It may, however, be possible to indicate something of the futility and irrelevance of legal processes merely by an imaginary application of the legal way of settling problems to a field in which decisions are customarily made in a more direct and efficient manner. Suppose, just for instance, a housewife, by repute one of the more practical species of human being, were to run her affairs for a day according to the legal pattern of principles, counter-principles, and concepts. Suppose, in the first place, she would of course be guided from afar by a dim and conveniently ambiguous ideal of personal justice. She would be bothered about doing the right thing, making the right decision, but since she would be her own Supreme Court, anything she did would be right after she did it. The difficulty would lie in deciding beforehand what to do and what not to do in accordance with the inexorable rules of her personal law. That law would have two primary principles. The first would be that anything which seems presently desirable is right. The second would be that anything which seems presently desirable is likely, in the long run, to be wrong. Of course, the two principles might occasionally seem to conflict in their application to a specific fact situation, but that would be of minor importance, since both, in the abstract, would be entirely valid legal principles. Each, moreover, would be buttressed with sub-principles and sub-sub-principles which might come in handy in making certain sorts of decisions. The lady's day begins. Her first decision, obviously, is whether to get up or to lie in bed a little longer. She remembers that the law is that anything which seems presently desirable is right, and certainly lying in bed seems presently very desirable. Yet before rushing to a snap judgment, she must dispose of the principle which holds that anything which seems presently desirable is likely, in the long run, to be wrong. That principle, of course, has certain exceptions and qualifications. One is to the effect that any action or inaction which seems presently so desirable that a failure to indulge the desire may affect the disposition over a period of hours will, in such circumstances, be the right action or inaction, at least if that period of hours is taken as controlling for the future. Clearly, that exception now applies. Yet in all fairness, the lady must admit that There is an exception to the desirable equals right rule, to the effect that the denial of whatever seems desirable may, by imparting a sense of nobility, become desirable in its own right and therefore proper. There seems to be a deadlock. It will be a close decision. Perhaps precedent will help. Yesterday the lady arose immediately. But yesterday's decision is not necessarily controlling because yesterday the sun was shining. Today is an ugly day. Such a disparity in the relevant facts cannot fairly be ignored. The problem remains unsettled. Then the lady remembers that she has an appointment with her hairdresser that morning. Manifestly, this brings into play the well-recognized legal rule, a sub-principle of the desire equals right principle, that appointments voluntarily made and in which time is of importance must be kept on time. The sub-principle that appointments involuntarily made in haste and later regretted need not be kept on time. And the sub-principle that appointments involuntarily made need not be kept at all are both obviously beside the point here. The law, finally tracked to earth, seems to decree that the lady must rise, and so she gets up. Not, of course, because she wants to keep an appointment with her hairdresser, rather because all the relevant legal principles point to such a decision. Anything which seems presently desirable is right, and she wants to get her hair done. Anything which seems presently desirable is likely in the long run to be wrong, and she would still like to be in bed a little longer. Anything so desirable that a failure to indulge the desire will affect the disposition is right in at least a limited sense, and if she doesn't get her hair done today, she'll go mad. The denial of what seems desirable can impart a sense of nobility, which makes the denial proper, and she will indeed feel noble if she gets right up. Appointments must be kept on time if you want to keep them on time, and the lady is afraid her hairdresser would be unable to fit her in later. Moreover, yesterday's precedent, although not here controlling, points suggestively to the same decision. There is thus no doubt at all about the law of the case, and the decision automatically follows the law. The lady's next two problems are comparatively easy, their answers dictated by long lines of solid precedent. Should she bother to brush her teeth? Yes, because she has always interpreted her law that way, under the general principle that whatever is said to be good for the health is right. Should she turn her hot shower cold before she gets out? No, because she has always interpreted her law that way, under the general principle that whatever is said to be good for the health is likely to be undesirable and therefore, by simple legal logic, wrong. That's, side note, interesting here. My naturopath that I was seeing last year, he told me that that is an old folk remedy for maintaining a healthy immunity system, is turning the shower cold right before you get out. It's something to do with cycling the blood back and forth, cycling the blood back into your core, and then it comes back to the skin when you get out of the shower. Interesting. And yet, here in 1939, they still knew about that, and you ask your doctor about that today, and he'll go, huh? Your allopathic doctor. Okay, back to the book. The choice of a dress to wear downtown, a choice which narrows down to a practical black number, 2 months old, and a brand new blue and white print, brings other legal concepts into the picture. There is the concept of economy, embodied in the principle that what is economical is right, and also in the sub-principle that what is economical in the short run is probably extravagant in the long run. And this concept seems to favor the black dress, which will not get dirty so easily. But the concept of smartness, a typical legal concept in that its contents and meaning are constantly changing from time to time and from place to place, seems to favor the blue and white dress. The lady's decision in this matter is judicial in the extreme. She bows to the paramount principle that in question of dress, whatever is smart is right, recognizing as she does, so that this is one of her rules of law to which there is almost no exception. The only legal question which ever arises concerning it being what is smart. But in deference to the principle of economy, she determines to keep her dress clean by riding downtown in a taxi instead of on a streetcar. In thus reconciling a conflict between two apparently irreconcilable principles, the lady has displayed her mastery of the legal process. Once downtown, the lady is aware that she has entered a different legal jurisdiction. The same general principles are, in the main, still good law, but their interpretation tends to vary. For instance, what seems presently desirable is still right, and what seems presently desirable is still likely in the long run to be wrong, yet the question as to what is presently desirable involves a greater emphasis on the rule that what other people believe to be proper is desirable, and a correspondingly lesser insistence on the home that what other people believe to be proper is usually undesirable. Thus the lady, after careful consideration of the question whether to give her hairdresser a generous tip or merely an adequate tip, finds the solution in the principle that what other people believe to be proper is desirable, especially when outside the home jurisdiction. Narrowing down this principle so that people means person, and person refers to the hairdresser, a simple legal deduction, she leaves a generous tip. This ruling is also in strict conformity with the abstract legal ideal of economy when considered in the light of the well-recognized legal tenet that what is economical in the short run is probably extravagant in the long run. Clearly the hairdresser might do a careless job on her next time if she left a stingy tip. At lunch, the lady is confronted with the problem whether to order or refrain from ordering a rich pastry dessert. Here the primary principles concerning desirability and the secondary principles concerning what is said to be healthy appear to be both cogent and conflicting, but only on the surface, of course. Reaching into the recesses of her legal system, the lady recalls that there is a pertinent and useful corollary to the sub-principle that the denial of whatever seems desirable may, by imparting a sense of nobility, become desirable and therefore right. The corollary is to the effect that whatever seems desirable but not too desirable may be denied with greater impunity than whatever seems extremely desirable, since the sense of nobility imparted by the denial depends on the denial itself and not on the degree of desirability of that which is desired. Accordingly, the lady passes up the cream puff. The lady's luncheon companion is going shopping. Will the lady come along? Decision, of course, must be dictated not by whim, but by law. It is the law that to waste time is wrong. It is, further, the law that to devote oneself to trivial matters when important matters demand attention is to waste time, and various household chores await the lady at home. Yet it is an accepted rule that, outside the home jurisdiction, household chores take on the color of triviality. The exception to this rule, that household chores assume extreme importance, especially outside the home jurisdiction, in the face of an unwanted invitation, is clearly inapplicable here. Furthermore, there exists an equitable principle frequently superseding the more rigid rules of law, that accommodation to the requests of others may be proper per se. The quote-unquote per se settles it. In the course of the shopping, the lady sees a hat. She does not need that hat, but she likes it and wants to own it. Decision here is extraordinarily simple, in line with the basic legal principles. The obviously relevant principle has the sanctity of constitutional doctrine and involves one of the most sacred of civil liberties. For freedom of contract may not, under any circumstances, nor under any guise of pseudo-legality, be denied. All the precedents and the entire history of her personal law point unswervingly to the conclusion that failure to purchase a becoming hat amounts to no less than an infringement of contract. The decree in the case is therefore automatic. And so it goes. Throughout the day, the lady's problems, major and minor, are subjected to a system of abstract and solemn-sounding principles which, for her, make up the law. Decision in each case is made in strict accordance with those principles. In fact, the principles dictate the proper answers. Finally, after dinner, the question arises whether the lady and her husband should go to the movies, or should instead stay home and listen to the radio, or go to bed early. She wants to go to the movies. Her husband wants to stay home. But clearly her husband's decision is not and should not be controlling. Like the decree of a lower court, it must be given due weight, and yet the whole problem must be carefully examined ab initio in order to ensure that final decision be rendered in accordance with the law. She remembers that the law is that anything which seems presently desirable is right. And certainly going to the movies seems presently very desirable. Yet before rushing to a snap judgment, she must dispose of the principle which holds that anything which seems presently desirable is likely in the long run to be wrong. That principle, of course, has certain exceptions and qualifications. One is to the effect that any action or inaction which seems presently so desirable that a failure to indulge the desire may affect the disposition over a period of hours will, in such circumstances, be the right action or inaction, at least if that period of hours is taken as controlling for the future. Clearly that exception now applies. Yet, in all fairness, the lady must admit that there is an exception to the desirable equals right rule, to the effect that the denial of whatever seems desirable may, by imparting a sense of nobility, become desirable in its own right, and therefore proper. There seems to be a deadlock. It will be a close decision. Perhaps precedent will help. Last night the lady and her husband went to the movies. But last night's decision is not necessarily controlling because last night it was Gary Cooper. Tonight it is some foreign film. Such a disparity in the relevant facts cannot fairly be ignored. The problem remains unsettled. Then the lady realizes that she is quite tired and has a busy day ahead of her tomorrow. Manifestly, this brings into play the well-recognized legal rule, a sub-principle of the desirable, probably wrong in the long run principle, that it is safer, even at some inconvenience, to look one's best at a tea party. Various sub-principles and exceptions and qualifications concerning the amount of inconvenience which the rule will tolerate are obviously beside the point here. The law, finally tracked to earth, seems to decree that the lady and her husband must stay home, and so they stay home. Not, of course, because the lady wants to look well at her tea party tomorrow. Rather, because all the relevant legal principles point to such a decision. Anything which seems presently desirable is right, and she wants to get enough sleep. Anything which seems presently desirable is likely in the long run to be wrong, and she would still rather like to go to a movie. Anything so desirable that a failure to indulge the desire will affect the disposition is right in at least a limited sense. And if she doesn't look well tomorrow, she'll never forgive herself. The denial of what seems desirable can impart a sense of nobility, which makes the denial proper. And she will indeed feel noble if she accedes to her husband's wish to stay home. It is safer to look one's best at tea parties, and the lady is afraid it might be unpleasant to flout this principle. Moreover, last night's precedent, although apparently pointing to the opposite decision, is clearly distinguishable. There is thus no doubt at all about the law of the case. And the decision automatically follows the law. Now, this resume of a lady's day in which all decisions are directed by abstract principles or rules of law may sound absurd in the extreme. It is plain that most of the principles are couched in such vague general language that they cannot possibly be guides to a specific decision on a specific matter. It is plain that practically every principle can be countered with another principle or exception which contradicts in whole or in part the first principle. It is plain that not one of the lady's decisions necessarily follows from the principle or concept which is said to dictate it. It is plain that in every instance the quote-unquote controlling principle or principles resembles nothing so much as a loose rationalization of what she is going to do, applied after the actual decision is made. Furthermore, it is plain that if someone else, say the lady's husband, had been acting as Supreme Court for her, many of the rulings would have gone the other way, even though the same set of guiding principles had been rigidly adhered to. In any conflict between the concepts of smartness and economy, for instance, the decision might have favored economy and yet done the proper obeisance to smartness under the rule that it is smart to be economical. Freedom of contract might well have been interpreted as freedom to refuse to buy a hat, no matter how becoming. Despite its limited scope, the lady's legal system would hardly have needed stretching to do double duty all the way down the line. Absurd indeed, but not one iota more absurd than the system of law under which we actually live. For most legal principles, too, are couched in such vague, general language that they cannot possibly be guides to a specific decision on a specific matter. Practically every legal principle, too, can be countered with another principle or exception which contradicts in whole or in part the first principle. Scarcely ever does a court decision necessarily follow from the principle or concept which is said to dictate it. And in just about every instance, the quote-unquote controlling principle or principles resembles nothing so much as a loose rationalization of what a court orders done, applied after the actual decision is made. If the lady's legal system and the way that system worked for her seems more patently ridiculous than the workings of the law, it is only because most of the principles of the law are phrased in unfamiliar and therefore impressive language, so that their vagueness, their contradictions, their frequent and obvious use merely to justify desired results, all these are concealed from the non-lawyer's untrained eye. Substitute, quote, within the legislative intent, unquote, for desirable. Substitute, quote, not violative of due process, unquote, for right. Substitute, quote, executory contract contemplating adequate consideration, unquote, for appointment with the hairdresser. And the lady's legal principles begin to take on a fake dignity, an air of solemnity and importance. This dignity, moreover, has no relation at all to the meaning or lack of meaning of the words used. Or, going at it from the opposite angle, take the well-bolstered legal principle that state regulation of private enterprise amounts to deprivation of property, without due process of law, unless sanctioned as a proper exercise of the state police power. Substitute for it the simple and equally enlightening statement that certain state laws are bad unless they are good. And the law begins to sound as silly as the lady. As a matter of fact, the law, and those who lay it down, are often considerably sillier than the lady. For the lady, as was perfectly apparent, knew what she wanted and decided accordingly, unbothered by the requirement that she justify each of her decisions with a broad generalization of principle. That requirement was easily satisfied because all the decisions she was called on to make affected her, the judge, directly and immediately. And because the business of fitting a principle to a ready-made decision was, as it always is in law and elsewhere, a simple matter. But the judges who make legal decisions frequently have not the slightest interest in the outcome of the cases they are deciding. Of course, if they have such an interest, and even judges are not immune from political and social emotions, they like or hate the New Deal, they approve or disapprove of labor unions, they trust or mistrust big business, then they can, and often do, consciously or unconsciously, revert to the legal procedure of the lady. They judge first and justify afterward. And in so doing, they are acting, if not in a judicial, at least in a practical manner. Parentheses. Being practical and being judicial, in the cold legal sense, are just about mutually exclusive anyway. End parentheses. In run-of-the-mill cases, however, the sort that make up much of the business of the law, the judges don't care who wins, nor what the eventual decision will be. The lawyers in the case always care. They know beforehand what decision they want, and so they, in the practical manner of the lady, can fit their generalizations, their legal pleading, to the desired result. Not so the judges. How, then, do the judges ever achieve an answer? What judges do, actually, is what the lady pretended to do, and, for that matter, what the judges themselves pretend to do when the answer is of any concern to them. They balance, don't laugh, one set of abstract principles against another, and, through some sort of trance-like transference, come out with a specific decision. They take the long words and the sonorous phrases of the law, no matter how ambiguous or empty of meaning, no matter how contradictory of each other, they weigh these words and phrases in a vacuum, which is the only way they could be weighed, and then they, quote-unquote, apply the weightier to the dispute in question with all the finality that might be accorded a straight wire from God. It is as though a court were to have considered, with complete disinterest, the case of our friend the lady. Were to have balanced against each other the principles put forth by opposing counsel to the effect that what is desirable is right, and that what is desirable is wrong. Were to have decided in the abstract, of course, that what is desirable is wrong, was the more compelling of the two, and were then to have informed the lady that since it is the law that what is desirable is wrong, therefore the lady must get out of bed. Certainly, time and time again, in actual law cases, opposing counsel will put forth as the basis of their arguments legal principles which are respectable and yet are directly contradictory. Equity will act when there is no adequate remedy at law, and equity need not act even though there is no adequate remedy at law. Peaceful picketing is legal and all picketing is illegal. Contributory negligence on the part of the plaintiff absolves the defendant of responsibility, and contributory negligence on the part of the plaintiff does not absolve the defendant of all responsibility. And time again, a court will grab one of the two contradictory principles and, with some slight elaboration, use it as the basis of decision. For it is the legend of the law that every legal dispute can and must be settled by hauling an abstract principle down to earth and pinning it to the dispute in question. The last thing any court will ever admit, even when it is being quite practical about what it decides, is that practical considerations have anything to do with the decision. To admit this would be to admit that it was not the law, that pile of polysyllabic abstractions that dictated the answer. Then, too, as judges are doubtless smart enough to realize, a man or a lady would scarcely need to be learned in the law in order to sit and hand down practical answers to what are, in the last analysis, no more than practical problems. Okay, that was Part 5 of Woe Unto You Lawyers by Fred Rodell from 1939. I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth.